Dr. Emily Harris has lived all her life on the border of two worlds, the light of science and darkness, where the fears and phobias of her patients reign. As an experienced psychotherapist, she has always found an explanation for even the strangest phenomena. Her husband's death a few years ago left a deep scar, but she masterfully concealed it by keeping her cool. He'd been killed in a car accident, one of those senseless deaths where miscalculated timing, red lights, and rain become the deciding factors. She kept working, not letting the pain take over, but the loneliness soaked into her life like a morning fog, permeating all her thoughts. Every day she returned to her empty house, the same house where her happy family had once lived. Every room was filled with memories of days gone by. Sometimes Emily thought she could hear his footsteps on the stairs, feel his presence at the dinner table. But it was the fear that she was slowly becoming hostage to her own feelings, her own pain, that bothered her most. She shut herself off into her work, withdrawing from her own grief, believing she would do better with her patients. This continued until Julia entered her office, a patient who was to change her perception of reality completely. Julia was young, almost transparent. Her skin was like white marble, and her long black hair flowed over her shoulders like dark streams. But that wasn't what caught Emily's attention. In her hands was a doll, an old, time-worn doll with faded eyes and a ceramic face. Julia held it tightly to her chest, as if it were her talisman, her only defense against something inevitable. Emily studied her with her gaze, but the girl's eyes were empty, like deep wells from which no feelings could be drawn. "Hello, Julia," Emily began, trying to find common ground. "Who's that with you?" Julia raised her head as if she had been awakened from a deep sleep. "It's Lily," she answered quietly. "She's watching me." Emily raised an eyebrow, trying to catch the meaning of the words. The girl was talking about this doll as if it were a living thing, and that bothered her more than she'd expected. "Is Lily following you?" she asked cautiously. "Why?" "Because she has to," Julia's voice was as steady as mechanical. "If she doesn't watch, they'll come after me." "Who are they?" Emily felt something cold touch her back. "Those who want to hurt me." Julia held the doll tighter to her chest. "But Lily always sees. She never closes her eyes." Emily made a note in her notebook, but her anxiety began to grow. The girl was clearly suffering from severe paranoia. But what worried her even more was the feeling that she herself was beginning to believe that the doll was really watching. Every time Emily looked at Lily, it seemed to her that the doll was staring back, catching her gaze, tracking her slightest movements. But it was silly. She tried to push those thoughts away and focus on the patient. For weeks, Julia came to every session with Lily. And each time she told more and more strange details. She talked about how the doll whispers to her, warning her of impending danger, how it protects her from those who watch from the shadows. "They keep trying to get into my room," Julia once said. Her voice was full of terror, and fear shone in her eyes. "But Lily keeps them out. She puts up defenses. I saw her close the window once when I was asleep." Emily held back the urge to say something rational that would break this madness. Her mind refused to accept these stories, but with each session the atmosphere in the office became more and more pressurized. Sometimes it seemed to her that the doll actually moved when she looked away. At times, when Julia left, Lily would stay in the study. The feeling was so real that Emily began to doubt her own sanity. One day, after a particularly stressful session, she stayed in the study, pondering how to help Julia. Outside, the rain was falling, and the loud clatter of drops on the glass seemed like the echo of something distant but insistent. Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker. Emily looked up. At first, she thought it was just a lamp malfunction. But then she saw something strange. Lily was lying on the table in front of her. She was sure Julia had taken her. Dr. Harris's hands trembled involuntarily. Suddenly, her office no longer seemed so safe. The doll's eyes, lifeless and glassy, seemed alive. They were staring right at her. Emily shuddered and stood up quickly, trying to focus. She put the doll away in the closet and left the office, convincing herself that it was just a mistake, an accident. But the feeling of unease didn't let her go all the way home. Julia came to the last session without Lily. That was unusual. Emily was surprised, but didn't ask any questions. Perhaps Julia had finally taken her advice. "Lily's not with you?" Emily asked, still curious. "She's gone," Julia answered calmly, but there was something different in her voice. Emily tried to continue the session, but it was going strangely. Julia answered one-word answers, her eyes seemed clouded, and there was a tense silence in the room. Finally, the session ended and Julia left. Emily breathed a sigh of relief, deciding that this was the last step toward recovery. But as she was closing the office, something tinkled in the darkness. Emily turned around. The tapping was repeated, as if someone was quietly tapping a finger on the desk. She slowly approached the desk, her heart pounding in her temples. Sitting on the edge of the table was Lily. Her glass eyes were open, and they were staring at Emily. Dr. Harris froze in place. Her brain tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening, but something inside her collapsed. A doll that wasn't supposed to be here was sitting in front of her as if it were alive. Glass eyes followed her every move, and the strange feeling that Lily understood more than she seemed to crawled into Emily's mind. The knocking intensified. Now it came not only from the table, but from all directions. It echoed against the walls of the office, penetrating her consciousness like a nightmare that refused to let go. It's just a joke," she whispered, taking a step back. Julia, she'd left her here. But her voice treacherously shook. In the darkness, it seemed to her that Lily had begun to move. Or was it just a trick of the eye? Emily took another step back, but her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, and when she looked up, the doll was sitting right in front of her. Her face was just as lifeless, but her eyes glittered, as if there was a new spark of life in them. At that moment, the lights in the study went out. Silence came over Emily, dense and unbearable. She felt something cold touch her neck. "Lily," she whispered into the void, her voice filled with despair. "You're not alive, are you?" There was no response. The darkness slowly squeezed her consciousness, like a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. The end. Or maybe not.